Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into something that's going to completely flip everything you thought you knew about medieval life. We're talking about cancer, disease, and a discovery so shocking that it's forcing historians and doctors to rewrite the textbooks. So before we get started, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to have your mind blown. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see our community spanning the globe. Now, settle in. Maybe grab a cup of tea, because what I'm about to share with you tonight is going to challenge one of the most persistent myths about medieval times. For decades, maybe even centuries, we've been told the same story over and over again. Medieval people died young, lived brutal lives, and rarely lived long enough to develop the kinds of diseases we see today. Cancer, we were assured, was essentially a modern plague, a byproduct of industrialization, pollution, and our extended lifespans. But here's the thing that's been bothering me, and it should bother you too. What if that entire narrative was wrong? What if we've been looking at medieval health through a lens so distorted that we've missed something massive? Something that changes everything we think we know about disease, about human history, and about the very nature of cancer itself. Because recently, a team of researchers did something that no one had ever done before. They took medieval skeletons, hundreds of years old, and they didn't just look at them the way archaeologists always had. They did something revolutionary. They put these ancient bones through modern CT scanners and X-ray machines. And what they found, what they discovered hiding inside these medieval bones, is going to shock you. The results were so unexpected, so dramatically different from what everyone believed, that the researchers had to double-check their work, then triple-check it, because if they were right, if what they were seeing was real, then everything we thought we knew about cancer in the Middle Ages was not just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong. We're talking about a discovery that suggests cancer rates in medieval Britain were potentially 10 times higher than anyone ever imagined. 10 times. Not 10% higher, not double, but an order of magnitude that completely rewrites the history of human disease. And the implications, the ripple effects of this discovery, they go far beyond just correcting a historical misconception. This research is forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about modern life, about what's really making us sick, and about whether our assumptions regarding the relationship between progress and health are fundamentally flawed. Because if medieval people were getting cancer at rates we never suspected, then what does that say about the cancer epidemic we're facing today? Tonight we're going to walk through this groundbreaking research step by step. We'll examine how they made this discovery, what it means for our understanding of medieval life, and why the implications reach far beyond dusty academic journals into the very heart of modern medicine and public health policy. But first, let's talk about the myth we've all been living with. The story we've been told goes something like this. Medieval people lived short, brutal lives. They died in their 30s, maybe 40s if they were lucky. They faced constant threats from warfare, famine, plague, and injury. Cancer was virtually unknown because people simply didn't live long enough to develop it. Cancer, according to this narrative, was a disease of modern civilization, a price we pay for longer lifespans and industrial progress. This story was supported by decades of archaeological research. When scientists examined medieval skeletons, they found very little evidence of cancer. Less than 1% of medieval remains showed signs of malignant disease. This seemed to confirm everything we believed. Medieval equals short lives and infectious disease. Modern equals long lives and cancer. Simple, clean, and apparently completely wrong. The problem was methodology. For generations, archaeologists and paleopathologists had been looking for cancer in all the wrong places. They were examining the surfaces of bones, looking for visible lesions and obvious signs of disease. But cancer, as any oncologist will tell you, doesn't always announce itself so dramatically. Much of the time, the evidence is hidden. buried deep within the bone structure, invisible to the naked eye. This is where our story takes a fascinating turn. Dr. Piers Mitchell and his team at Cambridge University decided to do something different. Instead of just looking at medieval bones, they decided to look inside them. Using the same technology that doctors use today to diagnose cancer in living patients, they began systematically scanning medieval skeletons with CT machines and X-ray equipment. The methodology was brilliant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. They gathered 143 skeletons from 6 medieval cemeteries in and around Cambridge, dating from the 6th to the 16th century. These weren't just random graves either. They represented a cross-section of medieval society: poor people from town cemeteries, wealthy individuals from prestigious burial sites, monks from an Augustinian friary, and patients from a medieval hospital. This diversity was crucial because it meant their findings would represent the full spectrum of medieval life, not just one social class or living situation. Each skeleton was carefully examined. They focused on specific bones, the vertebrae, femurs, and pelvis, because these are the areas where cancer most commonly spreads, when it metastasizes from other parts of the body. First, they conducted traditional visual inspections, looking for the kind of surface lesions that previous researchers had relied upon. Then came the revolutionary part. They subjected each bone to detailed CT scanning and X-ray analysis. What they found changed everything. Visually, just like previous studies, they detected very little evidence of cancer. The bones looked normal, unremarkable, exactly what you'd expect from medieval remains. But when they looked inside those same bones, when they peered beneath the surface with modern medical imaging, a completely different picture emerged. Hidden within bones that appeared perfectly healthy were clear signs of malignancy, lesions, structural changes, and patterns of bone destruction that could only be explained by metastatic cancer. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Bones that had fooled researchers for decades were revealing their secrets to modern technology. The numbers were staggering. Using traditional visual methods, they found evidence of cancer in just a handful of cases. But with CT scanning, they identified clear signs of malignancy in 5 individuals out of their sample of 143. That might not sound like much, but remember, this is just the cancer that spread to bone and was detectable even with modern technology. The vast majority of cancers never reach the skeleton at all. This is where the research becomes even more fascinating. The team didn't just count the cases they found and call it a day. They applied modern medical knowledge to extrapolate what these findings really meant. Today's oncologists know that only about 1/3 to 1/2 of all cancer deaths involve metastasis to bone. They also know that even the best CT scans only detect bone metastases about 75% of the time. Using these statistics, the researchers calculated backwards. If they found evidence of cancer in 5 individuals, and if modern medicine tells us that CT scans miss about 1/4 of bone cancers, and if only 1/3 to 1/2 of all cancers spread to bone in the first place, then the actual cancer rate in their medieval population must have been dramatically higher. Their calculations were startling. Instead of the less than 1% cancer rate that previous studies had suggested, they estimated that between 9 and 14% of medieval adults had cancer at the time of their death. Let me repeat that because it's important. 9 to 14% of medieval people died with cancer. Not from cancer necessarily, because many would have died from other causes first, but with cancer actively present in their bodies. This represents a complete revolution in our understanding of medieval health. We're not talking about a small correction to the historical record. We're talking about a fundamental reimagining of what life and death looked like in pre-industrial Europe. Cancer wasn't a rare curiosity in medieval times. It was a significant health challenge affecting roughly 1 in 10 adults. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The specific types of cancer they found tell us something important about medieval life and health. Most of the malignancies they detected were in the pelvis, which is consistent with cancers that commonly metastasize to bone, like breast, lung, prostate, and kidney cancers. But one case was particularly striking. A middle-aged man had small lesions throughout his skeleton, suggesting a blood cancer like leukemia or multiple myeloma. This finding is significant because blood cancers are often considered complex modern malignancies. The fact that they existed and were spreading systemically in medieval populations suggests that even sophisticated forms of cancer were present centuries before we developed the medical knowledge to understand them. The research team was careful to acknowledge the limitations of their study. They couldn't examine every bone in every skeleton. They had to be conservative in their interpretations, discounting any lesions that could have been caused by other conditions like bacterial infections. They couldn't perform biopsies or blood tests to confirm their diagnoses. Despite these limitations, the pattern was clear and undeniable. Medieval people were getting cancer at rates that completely contradict everything we thought we knew about historical disease patterns. This discovery forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our assumptions, not just about the past, but about the present as well. If medieval cancer rates were really between 9 and 14%, then what does that say about the cancer crisis we're facing today? Because the numbers from modern Britain paint a very different picture. Today, between 40 and 50% of people will develop cancer at some point in their lives. That's roughly 3 to 4 times higher than what these medieval populations experienced. Now you might be thinking, well, that makes sense, right? We live longer, we're exposed to more carcinogens, we have industrial pollution and tobacco. And you'd be absolutely correct about all of those factors. But here's what's fascinating about this comparison. The difference isn't as dramatic as we once believed. We went from thinking cancer was virtually non-existent in medieval times to discovering it affected 1 in 10 people. The gap between medieval and modern cancer rates is significant, but it's not the chasm we imagined. This discovery fundamentally changes how we think about cancer as a disease. For decades, the narrative has been that cancer is essentially a modern problem, a price we pay for longer lifespans and industrial progress. But if cancer was already claiming medieval lives at substantial rates, then maybe cancer isn't so much a modern invention as it is an amplification of something that's always been with us. The medieval people in this study weren't living in some pristine, pollution-free paradise. They faced their own environmental challenges. They breathed smoke from wood and coal fires every day. They drank alcohol regularly, often because it was safer than water. They were exposed to lead from pottery glazes and water pipes. They faced constant exposure to infectious diseases, many of which we now know can trigger cancerous changes in cells. But they weren't exposed to tobacco, which didn't reach Britain until the 16th century. They didn't work in industrial factories filled with asbestos, benzene, and dozens of other known carcinogens. They didn't live in cities choked with automotive exhaust, or eat foods treated with industrial pesticides. Their cancer rates represent something like a baseline, a glimpse into what human cancer rates might look like without the massive chemical burden of modern industrial life. The implications of this baseline are staggering when you really think about them. If 9 to 14% of people developed cancer, even in relatively clean medieval environments, then cancer appears to be an intrinsic part of the human condition. It's not just something that happens when we live too long or expose ourselves to too many toxins. It's something that emerges naturally from the complex biological processes that keep us alive. But that doesn't mean the modern increase is inevitable or acceptable. The 3 to 4-fold jump from medieval to modern cancer rates represents millions of additional cases, millions of lives cut short or forever altered by disease. And unlike medieval cancer, much of modern cancer is theoretically preventable. The World Health Organization estimates that 20% of all cancers worldwide are directly attributable to environmental factors. That's 1 in 5 cancer cases that could potentially be eliminated through better environmental policies, workplace protections, and lifestyle changes. When you apply that percentage to current cancer statistics, you're talking about preventing hundreds of thousands of cases every year. The story becomes even more complex when you consider what medieval life was actually like for the people in this study. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone in medieval times died in their 30s. That's one of the most persistent and misleading myths about medieval life expectancy. The average life expectancy numbers we always hear, those figures in the 30s and 40s, are heavily skewed by infant and child mortality. Medieval infant mortality was catastrophically high, somewhere around 30 to 40%. When nearly half of all children die before reaching adulthood, it drags down the average life expectancy for the entire population. But for those who survived childhood, the prospects were considerably better than most people realize. A medieval person who made it to age 25 could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or even 60s. Some reached their 70s and beyond. These weren't rare exceptions either. Historical records from medieval England show that, among the landowners, people who survived to adulthood had a mean life expectancy in their late 40s, with many living well into their 60s. This longer adult lifespan is crucial for understanding the cancer findings. Cancer typically takes years or decades to develop and spread. The fact that a significant portion of the medieval population lived long enough for cancers to develop and metastasize helps explain why the researchers found evidence of malignancy in their skeletal remains. But it also raises another important question. If medieval people were living longer than we thought and developing cancer at higher rates than we imagined, then what was actually killing them? The traditional narrative focuses on infectious diseases, warfare, accidents, and malnutrition. And certainly, these were major factors in medieval mortality. The Black Death alone killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. Dysentery, malaria, typhoid, smallpox, and tuberculosis were constant threats. But the cancer research suggests that chronic diseases like malignancy were also significant factors in medieval health, ones that have been largely invisible to historians until now. This invisibility wasn't just due to limitations in archaeological methods. Medieval medical understanding of cancer was extremely limited. The word cancer itself comes from the Greek word for crab, chosen because early physicians thought tumours resembled the shape of a crab with its claws extended. But medieval doctors had no understanding of metastasis, no concept of how cancers spread through the body, and virtually no effective treatments. Medieval surgical techniques were advancing during this period, and knowledge of human anatomy was growing, but this burst of medical knowledge didn't extend to cancer treatment. For someone diagnosed with a visible tumour in medieval times, the options were grim. Surgery was possible for external growths, but without anaesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of cancer biology, most procedures were more likely to hasten death than prevent it. This lack of effective treatment means that medieval cancer patients face their disease with little hope of recovery. Unlike today, where early detection and treatment can cure many cancers, medieval malignancies were essentially death sentences. The people whose bones showed evidence of cancer in this study likely suffered through months or years of progressive illness with no real medical intervention. The types of cancer found in the medieval remains also tell us something important about how the disease manifested in pre-industrial populations. The researchers found evidence of cancers that had metastasized to bone, which typically indicates advanced disease. The fact that they found both solid tumor metastases and what appeared to be blood cancers suggests that the full spectrum of malignancies was present in medieval populations. One particularly striking case involved a middle-aged man whose skeleton showed small lesions throughout multiple bones. This pattern is characteristic of hematological cancers like multiple myeloma or leukemia, diseases that affect the blood and bone marrow. These are complex malignancies that require sophisticated understanding to diagnose and treat effectively. The fact that they existed in medieval populations demonstrates that even the most challenging forms of cancer have been part of human experience for centuries. The diversity of the study population adds weight to these findings. The researchers weren't just looking at one social class or one type of community. They examined remains from urban and rural settings, from rich and poor, from religious communities and secular populations. This breadth suggests that cancer was affecting medieval society across all social boundaries. The poor people living in town faced different environmental exposures than the wealthy. The monks in the Augustinian friary lived under different conditions than the patients in the medieval hospital. Yet cancer appeared across all these different contexts, reinforcing the idea that malignancy was a consistent feature of medieval life, rather than something affecting only specific populations. This social diversity also helps us understand something important about medieval life that often gets overlooked in popular narratives. Medieval society was more complex and varied than the simplified peasant and noble dichotomy that dominates popular culture. There were merchants, artisans, clergy, scholars, and countless other occupations and social roles. Each group faced different health challenges and lived under different conditions. The fact that cancer appeared across this social spectrum suggests that whatever factors were driving medieval malignancy rates, they were broad enough to affect people regardless of their social status or living conditions. This could point to fundamental biological factors, shared environmental exposures, or infectious agents that crossed social boundaries. Understanding medieval cancer rates also sheds new light on the relationship between infectious disease and cancer. We now know that certain infections can trigger cancerous changes in cells. Human papillomavirus can cause cervical cancer. Hepatitis B and C can lead to liver cancer. Helicobacter pylori bacteria can contribute to stomach cancer. Medieval populations had extensive exposure to various pathogens that might have contributed to cancer development. The high burden of parasitic infections in medieval times adds another layer to this story. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval people were regularly infected with various intestinal worms and other parasites. Some parasites are now known to be carcinogenic. The liver fluke, for example, can cause bile duct cancer. While we can't directly link specific parasites to the cancers found in medieval bones, the high parasite burden might have contributed to overall cancer risk. The infectious disease environment of medieval Europe was dramatically different from what we experience today. Tuberculosis was endemic. Leprosy was common. Various forms of plague circulated regularly. This constant exposure to pathogens would have kept medieval immune systems under constant stress, potentially creating conditions that favoured cancer development. But it's important not to oversimplify this relationship. The connection between infections and cancer is complex and varies greatly depending on the specific pathogen and the individual's immune response. Some infections might actually protect against certain cancers by stimulating immune surveillance. The medieval disease environment was a complex ecosystem that we're only beginning to understand. The medieval diet presents another fascinating piece of this cancer puzzle, one that challenges many assumptions about nutrition and health in pre-industrial times. When we think of medieval food, most of us picture a grim tableau of gruel, stale bread, and the occasional scrap of meat. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story, one that might help explain why cancer rates were higher than expected while still remaining well below modern levels. Medieval nutrition was far more sophisticated and varied than popular culture suggests. The backbone of the medieval diet was indeed cereals, particularly wheat, which could constitute up to 3/4 of an average person's daily calories by the 9th century. But this wasn't just empty carbohydrates. Medieval grains were often more nutritious than their modern counterparts, higher in protein and fibre, and processed in ways that preserved many essential nutrients. What's particularly interesting is how religious observance shaped medieval eating patterns in ways that might have provided some protection against cancer. The Roman Catholic Church mandated that meat be avoided for roughly a third of the year, including the entire 40-day period of Lent and numerous other fasting days throughout the calendar. This wasn't just spiritual discipline, it was inadvertent dietary intervention on a massive scale. During these fasting periods, medieval populations consumed significantly more fish, legumes, and plant-based foods. Fish provided omega-3 fatty acids and high-quality protein. Legumes offered fiber and plant compounds that modern research suggests might have anti-cancer properties. The forced dietary diversity that came with religious fasting may have created a more balanced nutritional profile than a meat-heavy diet would have provided. The social stratification of medieval food consumption reveals some surprising paradoxes that might have affected cancer rates differently across social classes. The wealthy, contrary to what you might expect, often had less healthy diets than the common people. Noble tables featured refined foods that were stripped of fiber and nutrients. They avoided many vegetables, considering them beneath their social status. Only rape, onions, garlic and leeks were deemed worthy of aristocratic consumption. Meanwhile, the poor were eating what we'd now recognize as a more balanced diet rich in vegetables, whole grains and dairy products that the wealthy scorned as inferior foods. This dietary pattern might explain why cancer appeared across social classes in the Cambridge study, rather than clustering among the poor, as you might expect if malnutrition were the primary factor. The medieval beverage landscape adds another layer to this nutritional story. Water was often avoided due to concerns about purity and contamination, concerns that were entirely justified given medieval sanitation systems. Instead, people at every social level consumed alcoholic beverages as their primary source of hydration. This wasn't recreational drinking as we understand it today. It was a practical health measure. Beer and ale were consumed daily, often in quantities that would shock modern sensibilities, but these weren't the high alcohol beverages we know today. Medieval ales were typically low in alcohol content, around 2 to 3%, making them more like liquid bread than intoxicants. They provided calories, B vitamins, and most importantly, they were safe to drink because the fermentation process killed harmful bacteria. Wine was also common, particularly among the wealthy, and in regions where grapes could be grown successfully. Both beer and wine contain compounds that modern research suggests might have some protective effects against certain cancers. Resveratrol in wine and various antioxidants in fermented grain beverages could theoretically have provided some defense against malignancy. But alcohol consumption also comes with cancer risks, something medieval people couldn't have known. Regular alcohol consumption is now linked to increased rates of liver, breast, colorectal, and several other cancers. The medieval population was consuming alcohol daily throughout their adult lives, which might have contributed to the cancer rates discovered in the Cambridge study. The absence of tobacco from medieval Europe until the 16th century represents one of the most significant differences between medieval and modern cancer risk profiles. Tobacco use is responsible for roughly 30% of all cancer deaths in developed countries today. Lung cancer, which is now one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, was virtually unknown in medieval times. The first tobacco seeds didn't reach European soil until the 1500s, and widespread tobacco use didn't develop until much later. This means the medieval populations in the Cambridge study lived their entire lives without exposure to what is now recognized as one of the most potent carcinogens in human history. The fact that they still develop cancer at rates approaching 10 to 14% suggests that tobacco, while catastrophically dangerous, was amplifying existing cancer risks rather than creating them from nothing. Industrial pollution represents the other major difference between medieval and modern cancer environments. Pre-industrial Britain wasn't exactly pristine. Medieval people faced their own environmental hazards. They breathed smoke from wood and coal fires daily, often in poorly ventilated spaces. They were exposed to lead from pottery glazes, water pipes, and various crafting processes. They handled toxic materials in their work without any understanding of safety precautions. But the scale and variety of chemical exposure in medieval times was orders of magnitude smaller than what modern populations face. Today, American companies use over 100,000 different chemicals, with more than 1,000 new ones created every year. Since the Industrial Revolution, workers have been exposed to unsafe levels of asbestos, carbon monoxide, arsenic, benzene, beryllium, vinyl chloride, and countless other carcinogens. The health consequences have been staggering. Researchers have identified over 200 forms of cancer associated with occupational exposure alone. Studies of cancer deaths between 1950 and 1969 found higher rates of lung, liver, and bladder cancer in counties with the highest concentration of chemical industry activity. The Environmental Protection Agency has classified over 150 chemicals as carcinogenic or likely carcinogenic to humans. This industrial chemical burden helps explain the 3- to 4-fold increase in cancer rates from medieval to modern times. The World Health Organization estimates that 20% of cancers worldwide are directly attributable to environmental risks, predominantly air pollution, chemical exposure, radiation, and occupational hazards. That's millions of cancer cases that could theoretically be prevented through environmental interventions. The medieval cancer findings also force us to reconsider our understanding of cancer as a disease of aging. The conventional wisdom has long been that cancer is primarily a consequence of cellular damage accumulating over long lifespans. The longer you live, the more time your cells have to develop mutations that can lead to malignancy. This explanation seemed to make sense when we believed medieval people died young and rarely developed cancer. But the Cambridge research suggests a more complex relationship between age and cancer. Even in a population with shorter average lifespans, cancer was affecting a significant percentage of adults. This implies that cancer development isn't simply a function of accumulated cellular damage over decades. Some cancers can develop and spread relatively quickly, even in younger adults. The age distribution of the medieval cancer cases provides some insight into this pattern. The researchers found evidence of malignancy across different age groups, not just in the oldest individuals. This suggests that medieval people were developing cancers in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, not just in extreme old age. Some forms of cancer, particularly blood cancers, like the one found in the middle-aged man with lesions throughout his skeleton, can progress rapidly regardless of age. This age pattern has implications for how we think about modern cancer prevention and treatment. If cancer can develop relatively early in adult life, as the medieval evidence suggests, then prevention efforts need to focus on younger populations, not just the elderly. Early detection programs, lifestyle interventions, and environmental protections become even more critical when we understand that cancer risk begins accumulating early in adult life. The types of cancers found in the medieval remains also provide clues about the biological mechanisms driving cancer development in pre-industrial populations. Most of the evidence pointed to cancers that had metastasized to bone, particularly in the pelvis. This pattern is consistent with breast, lung, prostate, and kidney cancers, all of which commonly spread to skeletal sites. The presence of what appeared to be blood cancer adds another dimension to the medieval cancer story. Hematological malignancies like leukemia and multiple myeloma are complex diseases that affect the blood and bone marrow. They don't arise from exposure to external carcinogens in the same way that lung or skin cancers do. Instead, they often result from genetic mutations or immune system dysfunction. The fact that blood cancers existed in medieval populations suggests that the fundamental biological processes that can lead to malignancy were operating even in pre-industrial environments. These aren't diseases that require modern chemicals or radiation to develop. They emerge from the complex cellular processes that govern blood cell production and immune function. Understanding medieval blood cancers also highlights the sophistication of cancer as a disease process. These aren't simple tumours that grow in one location. They're systemic diseases that affect multiple organs and can spread throughout the body. The medieval patient with lesions in multiple bones was experiencing the same kind of systemic cancer spread that modern oncologists see regularly. The research methodology that uncovered these medieval cancer cases represents a revolution in archaeological techniques that could reshape our understanding of disease throughout history. For generations, paleopathologists had been limited to examining the surfaces of ancient bones, looking for obvious signs of disease or trauma. This approach worked well for detecting fractures, arthritis, or infectious diseases that left clear marks on bone surfaces. But cancer often hides its tracks more cleverly. Malignancies can grow within bones, destroying internal structure while leaving the exterior looking perfectly normal. The Cambridge team's decision to use CT scanning and X-ray technology on medieval remains was inspired by modern medical practice, where doctors routinely look inside patients' bodies to diagnose disease. The contrast between what they found through visual inspection versus medical imaging was stark and revealing. Bones that had appeared completely healthy to generations of archaeologists were hiding clear evidence of malignancy when examined with modern technology. This technological leap allowed researchers to peer inside medieval bones and detect cancers that had been invisible for centuries. The implications extend far beyond this single study. If CT scanning can reveal hidden cancers in medieval remains, what might it uncover in skeletal collections from other time periods and cultures? The researchers specifically called for applying this methodology to Neolithic remains, ancient Egyptian mummies, Roman skeletal collections, and indigenous populations from around the world. Each of these investigations could provide crucial data points for understanding how cancer rates have changed throughout human history and across different environmental conditions. Were cancer rates different in hunter-gatherer populations compared to early agricultural societies? Did ancient urban centres have higher cancer rates than rural areas? How did cancer prevalence vary between different climates, diets, and cultural practices? The answers to these questions could fundamentally reshape our understanding of cancer as a human disease. If cancer rates were consistently higher throughout history than previously believed, it would suggest that malignancy is a more intrinsic part of the human condition than we've assumed. If rates varied dramatically between different populations and time periods, it would provide crucial clues about which environmental and lifestyle factors most strongly influence cancer development. The medieval cancer research also highlights the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration in advancing scientific knowledge. This breakthrough required expertise from archaeology, radiology, oncology, epidemiology, and medieval history. No single discipline could have made this discovery alone. It took archaeologists to identify and excavate the skeletal remains, radiologists to interpret the medical imaging, oncologists to understand cancer biology, and epidemiologists to calculate population-level disease rates. This collaborative approach represents the future of historical disease research. As technology continues to advance, we'll likely see more sophisticated techniques applied to ancient remains. DNA analysis might reveal genetic predispositions to cancer in historical populations. Chemical analysis of bones and teeth might detect exposure to specific carcinogens. Advanced imaging techniques might uncover even more subtle signs of disease. The human stories behind these medieval cancer cases add a poignant dimension to the scientific findings. Each skeleton with evidence of malignancy represents a person who lived, loved, worked, and suffered through a disease they couldn't understand or effectively treat. The middle-aged man with blood cancer spreading throughout his bones likely experienced months or years of progressive weakness, pain, and declining health, with no real medical intervention available. These weren't just statistics or data points. They were people facing one of humanity's most challenging diseases with courage, faith, and whatever support their communities could provide. Medieval medical understanding of cancer was extremely limited, but that doesn't mean cancer patients were abandoned or ignored. Families cared for dying relatives, religious communities provided spiritual comfort, and healers offered whatever treatments they believed might help, however ineffective those treatments might have been. The social and economic impact of cancer in medieval communities would have been significant, even if the disease itself wasn't well understood. A breadwinner developing cancer would have threatened the economic stability of entire families. The gradual decline in health and productivity would have affected not just the patient, but everyone who depended on them. Medieval communities were tightly interconnected webs of mutual dependence. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers all relied on each other for goods, services, and support. When cancer struck productive members of these communities, the ripple effects would have been felt by many people. This social dimension of medieval cancer adds another layer to our understanding of how disease shaped historical societies. The discovery of significant cancer rates in medieval populations also raises questions about how historical narratives are constructed and perpetuated. For decades, the story of medieval health focused almost exclusively on infectious diseases, warfare, accidents, and malnutrition. Cancer was relegated to a footnote, mentioned only as a curiosity that rarely affected historical populations. This narrative wasn't necessarily wrong, but it was incomplete. Infectious diseases certainly were major killers in medieval times. The Black Death, tuberculosis, dysentery, and countless other pathogens claimed millions of lives. But by focusing exclusively on acute infectious diseases, historians and medical researchers missed the chronic disease burden that was also affecting medieval populations. The Cambridge study suggests that medieval health was more complex and nuanced than traditional narratives suggested. People weren't just dying quickly from plague or violence. Some were living long enough to develop chronic diseases like cancer, then suffering through prolonged illnesses that might have lasted months or years. This adds a different dimension to medieval mortality patterns and suggests that the experience of illness and death in medieval times was more varied than commonly portrayed. This complexity extends to our understanding of medieval medicine and healing practices. While it's true that medieval physicians had limited understanding of cancer biology and no effective treatments for advanced malignancies, they weren't completely helpless in the face of disease. Medieval medicine included sophisticated surgical techniques, extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, and holistic approaches to health that considered diet, environment, and lifestyle. Some medieval treatments, while not specifically targeted at cancer, might have provided comfort or even modest therapeutic benefits to cancer patients. Pain management using opium poppies or willow bark could have eased suffering. Nutritional support and herbal remedies might have helped maintain strength and immune function. The psychological and spiritual care provided by medieval healers and clergy could have improved quality of life even when cure wasn't possible. The question of what medieval healers actually understood about cancer becomes even more intriguing when we examine the historical medical texts that have survived from this period. Medieval physicians weren't working in complete darkness when it came to recognizing malignant disease. They had inherited medical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates, who had described various forms of cancer centuries earlier. Medieval medical manuscripts contain surprisingly detailed descriptions of tumors, ulcerations, and growths that we would now recognize as cancerous lesions. These physicians used terms like canker and wolf to describe aggressive spreading sores that refuse to heal. While they didn't understand the cellular mechanisms behind these conditions, they could certainly observe their progression and devastating effects. The treatments they prescribed were often brutal by modern standards, but they weren't entirely without merit. Medieval surgeons would attempt to remove visible tumors, sometimes with remarkable skill given their limited tools and knowledge. They used cauterization with hot irons to destroy diseased tissue, a technique that bears some resemblance to modern ablation therapies. They prescribed dietary modifications, herbal preparations, and lifestyle changes that might have provided some palliative benefit. But perhaps most importantly, medieval medicine recognized that some diseases were beyond cure. The concept of providing comfort care, managing pain, and supporting families through terminal illness was well established in medieval medical practice. Cancer patients in medieval times may not have had access to effective treatments, but they weren't necessarily abandoned to suffer alone. The religious dimension of medieval healthcare adds another layer to how cancer was understood and managed in these communities. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on caring for the sick as a spiritual duty. Monasteries operated hospitals and infirmaries that provided care for the indigent and terminally ill. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense, focused on cure and treatment, but rather places of refuge and comfort for those facing death. The medieval understanding of suffering was profoundly different from our modern perspective. Illness and death were seen as part of the human condition, opportunities for spiritual growth and preparation for the afterlife. This worldview might have provided some psychological comfort to cancer patients and their families, offering a framework for understanding suffering that went beyond purely medical explanations. The Cambridge study's findings also illuminate the hidden burdens carried by medieval women, who made up a significant portion of the skeletal remains examined. Medieval women faced unique health challenges that might have influenced their cancer risks in ways we're only beginning to understand. Repeated pregnancies and childbirth in an era without modern medical care placed enormous stress on women's bodies and immune systems. Medieval women also had different occupational exposures than men. They worked extensively with textiles, using dyes and chemicals that might have been carcinogenic. They managed household fires and cooking, leading to constant exposure to smoke and combustion products. They handled food preservation processes involving salt, smoke, and various chemical treatments that could have contributed to cancer risk. The social restrictions placed on medieval women might have affected their health outcomes in complex ways. Limited access to diverse foods, restricted mobility, and the stress of their subordinate social position could all have influenced their susceptibility to disease. Yet women in medieval times also had some protective factors that might have reduced certain cancer risks. Lower alcohol consumption compared to men, less exposure to occupational hazards, and different dietary patterns might have provided some advantages. The occupational health landscape of medieval Europe presents a fascinating contrast to modern industrial hazards. Medieval workers faced their own set of carcinogenic exposures, though the scale and variety were dramatically different from what we see today. Metalworkers and blacksmiths were exposed to heavy metals and combustion products. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals used in leather processing. Miners faced exposure to various minerals and dust that could contribute to respiratory cancers. Medieval urban environments presented their own unique health challenges. Cities were dense, poorly ventilated, and filled with craft workshops that produced various forms of air and water pollution. The famous medieval guilds weren't just economic organizations, they were also occupational health hazards, clustering specific types of workers and their associated disease risks. But the scale of these exposures was fundamentally different from modern industrial hazards. A medieval blacksmith might work with iron and charcoal, exposing himself to some heavy metals and combustion products. A modern steelworker faces exposure to dozens of different chemicals, many of them known carcinogens, in quantities that dwarf anything a medieval craftsman would have encountered. The agricultural foundation of medieval society also shaped cancer risk patterns in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our modern perspective. The vast majority of medieval people lived in rural environments and worked directly with the land. This lifestyle provided some protection from urban pollution and industrial hazards, but it came with its own set of health challenges. Medieval farmers used animal manure as fertilizer, creating exposure to various parasites and pathogens. They stored grain in conditions that could lead to mold contamination, potentially exposing them to mycotoxins that are now known to be carcinogenic. They lived in close proximity to domestic animals, sharing diseases and parasites that could contribute to cancer risk. Seasonal variation in medieval life created health patterns that are almost impossible to replicate in modern studies. Medieval people experienced dramatic changes in diet, activity levels, and environmental exposures throughout the year. Winter months brought different challenges than summer seasons. Harvest time created different stress patterns than planting seasons. These cyclical variations might have influenced cancer development in ways that steady-state modern lifestyles don't replicate. The human immune system and cellular repair mechanisms evolved in environments with significant seasonal variation. The relatively stable conditions of modern life, while comfortable and convenient, might not provide the optimal conditions for maintaining cellular health over long periods. The genetic landscape of medieval populations adds another dimension to understanding their cancer rates. Medieval communities were often more genetically homogeneous than modern populations, with less migration and mixing between distant groups. This genetic homogeneity could have concentrated certain cancer susceptibility genes in specific populations while providing protection against others. Medieval marriage patterns, often within relatively small geographic communities, could have amplified both protective and harmful genetic traits related to cancer risk. Some communities might have had genetic profiles that provided natural resistance to certain types of cancer. Others might have been particularly vulnerable to specific malignancies due to inherited genetic variations. The absence of modern medical interventions in medieval times also meant that natural selection was operating more directly on cancer susceptibility. People with genetic profiles that made them highly susceptible to early onset cancers were less likely to survive to reproductive age and pass those genes to future generations. This selection pressure might have maintained relatively lower cancer rates compared to what we might see in populations without this selective filtering. The medieval understanding of heredity was limited, but not entirely absent. Medieval people recognized that certain diseases and physical traits ran in families. They might have observed patterns of illness that we would now recognize as genetic predispositions to cancer, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand the underlying mechanisms. Family caregiving patterns in medieval times also meant that cancer patients were typically cared for within extended family networks, rather than in institutional settings. This intimate caregiving relationship would have made the progression and symptoms of cancer highly visible to family members, potentially influencing their own health behaviors and life choices. The economic implications of cancer in medieval society extended far beyond individual families to affect entire communities and regions. Medieval economies were highly localized and dependent on the productivity of specific individuals with specialized skills. The loss of a master craftsman, experienced farmer, or skilled merchant to a prolonged illness like cancer could have significant ripple effects throughout a community. Medieval guilds and craft organizations developed systems for supporting members who became unable to work due to illness. These early forms of social insurance provided some protection for families facing the economic devastation that could accompany serious illness. While these systems weren't specifically designed for cancer care, they would have provided crucial support for families dealing with the prolonged decline that characterizes many forms of cancer. The seasonal nature of medieval economic activity also influenced how illness and death affected communities. A farmer developing cancer during planting season would have different economic impacts than someone falling ill during winter months. The timing of illness could determine whether families had adequate food stores to survive periods of reduced productivity. Medieval trade networks, while limited compared to modern global commerce, still created pathways for disease transmission that might have influenced cancer patterns. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers carried not just goods and ideas, but also pathogens and parasites between communities. Some of these infectious agents are now known to contribute to cancer development, suggesting that medieval trade might have inadvertently spread cancer risk factors along with economic opportunities. The preservation of medieval medical records provides glimpses into how individual cancer cases were understood and treated by the medical practitioners of the time. These documents, while limited in number and often difficult to interpret, offer invaluable insights into the lived experience of cancer in medieval communities. Medieval physicians kept detailed case notes describing their observations of various diseases and their attempted treatments. While their terminology and diagnostic categories were very different from modern medical language, careful analysis of these records can sometimes identify cases that were likely cancer. Descriptions of progressive wasting diseases, non-healing ulcers, and painful swellings often match patterns we now associate with various forms of malignancy. The cost of medical care in medieval times meant that detailed medical records were often limited to wealthy patients who could afford professional physician care. This creates a bias in our historical understanding, as the medical experiences of common people were less likely to be documented in surviving records. The Cambridge study's inclusion of remains from various social classes helps address this bias by providing evidence of cancer across the full spectrum of medieval society. Medieval hospital records from religious institutions provide another window into how cancer was managed in institutional settings. These documents often focused more on spiritual care and comfort measures than on aggressive medical interventions, reflecting the medieval understanding that some diseases were beyond human ability to cure. The role of medieval women in healthcare, particularly as midwives and healers, adds another dimension to understanding how cancer was recognized and treated in medieval communities. Women often served as primary healthcare providers for their families and communities, accumulating practical knowledge about disease progression and symptom management through direct experience. Medieval women's medical knowledge was typically transmitted orally rather than through written texts, making it more difficult for modern researchers to reconstruct their understanding of diseases like cancer. However, surviving folk remedies and traditional healing practices sometimes preserve echoes of medieval approaches to managing serious illness. The integration of medieval cancer findings with broader patterns of historical disease requires careful consideration of how different types of evidence complement and contradict each other. Written medical records, archaeological remains, artistic depictions of illness, and surviving folk traditions all provide different perspectives on medieval health that must be synthesized to create a complete picture. The Cambridge study represents just one piece of this larger puzzle, but it's a crucial piece that forces us to reconsider many assumptions about medieval health and disease. The discovery that cancer was far more prevalent than previously believed doesn't invalidate other evidence about medieval health challenges, but it does require us to develop more nuanced and complex models of how disease shaped medieval society. The implications of this research extend into modern public health policy and cancer prevention strategies. Understanding baseline cancer rates in pre-industrial populations provides crucial data for assessing the effectiveness of modern prevention efforts and identifying which risk factors are most amenable to intervention. The 3- to 4-fold increase in cancer rates from medieval to modern times represents both a public health crisis and an opportunity. If environmental factors are responsible for much of this increase, then environmental interventions could potentially return cancer rates toward their historical baseline levels. This isn't about returning to medieval living conditions, but rather about identifying and eliminating the specific modern exposures that are driving increased cancer rates. The World Health Organization's estimate that 20% of cancers are directly attributable to environmental factors takes on new significance when viewed against the medieval baseline. If medieval populations faced a 9 to 14% cancer rate in relatively clean environments, and modern populations face 40 to 50% rates in heavily polluted environments, then aggressive environmental interventions could potentially prevent millions of cancer cases. The medieval cancer research also highlights the importance of long-term thinking in public health policy. The chemical exposures and environmental changes that are driving modern cancer rates often have delayed effects that don't become apparent for decades. The medieval population serves as a control group, showing us what human cancer rates look like without these modern exposures. This long-term perspective is crucial for evaluating the true costs and benefits of industrial and technological development. The economic benefits of chemical manufacturing, industrial processes, and modern lifestyle conveniences must be weighed against their health consequences, including cancer risks that might not become apparent until generations later. The research methodology that uncovered medieval cancer also demonstrates the power of applying modern technology to historical questions. The combination of traditional archaeological methods with advanced medical imaging represents a new frontier in historical research that could revolutionize our understanding of disease patterns throughout human history. The success of CT scanning in revealing hidden cancers in medieval bones suggests that similar approaches could be applied to other historical health questions. What were the rates of heart disease, stroke, or other chronic conditions in pre-industrial populations? How did disease patterns vary between different cultures, climates, and time periods? Modern medical technology could potentially answer questions that have puzzled historians and epidemiologists for generations. The interdisciplinary collaboration required for this type of research also points toward new models of academic investigation that bridge traditional disciplinary boundaries. The medieval cancer study required expertise from archaeology, radiology, oncology, epidemiology, medieval history, and statistics. No single academic department or research institution could have completed this work alone. This collaborative approach represents the future of complex research questions that require multiple types of expertise and evidence. Climate change, infectious disease emergence, environmental health, and many other contemporary challenges require similar interdisciplinary approaches that can synthesize evidence from multiple sources and perspectives. The human dimension of medieval cancer, the individual stories of suffering and resilience behind the statistical findings, reminds us that disease is never just a biological phenomenon, but always also a social and cultural experience. The medieval cancer patients whose bones revealed their hidden struggles lived full lives, contributed to their communities, and faced their illnesses with whatever resources and support systems were available to them. Understanding how medieval communities cared for cancer patients, how families coped with prolonged illness, and how social institutions responded to chronic disease provides valuable insights into the human capacity for adaptation and resilience in the face of serious health challenges. These historical examples offer both inspiration and practical lessons for modern healthcare systems, struggling to provide compassionate care for cancer patients and their families. The medieval cancer discovery ultimately challenges us to think more deeply about what it means to be human in the face of disease and mortality. Cancer has been with us far longer than we realized, shaping human experience and communities in ways we're only beginning to understand. This knowledge doesn't diminish the tragedy of cancer or reduce the urgency of finding better treatments and prevention strategies. Instead, it places our modern cancer crisis in historical context and provides new tools for understanding and addressing one of humanity's most persistent health challenges. Challenges. The medieval findings force us to confront an uncomfortable reality about modern cancer prevention efforts. If baseline human cancer rates hover around 9 to 14%, even in relatively clean environments, then a significant portion of cancer cases may be unavoidable regardless of our prevention strategies. This doesn't mean prevention is futile, but it does suggest we need more realistic expectations about what environmental and lifestyle interventions can achieve. Modern cancer prevention campaigns often promise dramatic reductions in cancer rates through lifestyle modifications. Quit smoking, eat more vegetables, exercise regularly, avoid processed foods, and you can supposedly slash your cancer risk. While these interventions certainly help, The medieval evidence suggests there's a biological floor below which cancer rates cannot fall, no matter how perfect our prevention efforts become. This biological baseline has profound implications for healthcare policy and resource allocation. If roughly 1 in 10 people will develop cancer regardless of prevention efforts, then we need healthcare systems designed to handle that irreducible minimum cancer burden. The medieval evidence suggests that cancer isn't an aberration or failure of modern life, but rather an intrinsic feature of human biology that emerges naturally from the complex cellular processes that keep us alive. The specific cancers found in medieval bones also provide clues about which types of malignancy represent this biological baseline versus those that are primarily driven by modern environmental exposures. The bone metastases discovered in medieval remains came from cancers that commonly spread to skeletal sites: breast, lung, prostate, kidney, and blood cancers. These malignancies appear to have existed at significant rates even in pre-industrial populations. In contrast, certain other cancer types showed dramatic increases from medieval to modern times. Lung cancer, now one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, was virtually unknown in medieval populations who had no exposure to tobacco smoke or industrial air pollution. Skin cancer rates have exploded with increased sun exposure and the depletion of atmospheric ozone. Certain liver and bladder cancers linked to industrial chemicals were likely rare in medieval times. This distinction between baseline biological cancers and environmentally driven malignancies has crucial implications for prevention strategies. Resources invested in reducing tobacco use, industrial pollution, and occupational chemical exposures can potentially prevent cancers that exceed the medieval baseline. But even perfect environmental controls won't eliminate the cancers that appear to emerge naturally from human cellular biology. The age patterns of medieval cancer provide another perspective on how we think about cancer screening and early detection programs. The Cambridge researchers found evidence of malignancy across different age groups, not just in the oldest individuals. This suggests that cancer development in medieval times wasn't simply a function of extreme longevity, but could occur in middle-aged adults who had lived long enough for malignancies to develop and spread. Modern cancer screening programs are typically designed around assumptions about age-related cancer risk that may need revision in light of medieval evidence. If cancers were developing and metastasizing in medieval populations with shorter average lifespans, then the relationship between age and cancer risk might be more complex than current screening guidelines assume. The medieval evidence also highlights the importance of distinguishing between cancer incidence and cancer mortality. The 9 to 14% of medieval adults who had cancer at death doesn't necessarily mean they died from cancer. Many may have died from other causes, infectious diseases, accidents, or complications of other conditions, while harboring cancers that hadn't yet become terminal. This distinction is crucial for understanding modern cancer statistics. When we hear that 40 to 50% of modern people will develop cancer, that doesn't mean half the population will die from cancer. Many cancers are now detected early and treated successfully. Others progress slowly enough that patients die from other causes first. The medieval evidence suggests that even in times when cancer was essentially untreatable, not everyone who developed cancer necessarily died from it. The types of medieval cancer detected through CT scanning also reveals something important about the natural history of malignant disease. The fact that researchers found evidence of metastatic cancer in medieval bones suggests that these individuals lived long enough for their cancers to spread from their original sites to their skeletons. This process typically takes months or years, indicating that medieval cancer patients experienced prolonged periods of illness. This prolonged illness trajectory has implications for understanding medieval social support systems and community resilience. Families and communities had to cope with members who gradually declined over extended periods, requiring care and support while contributing less to household and community productivity. The social infrastructure that supported these prolonged illnesses provides insights into medieval approaches to chronic disease management. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for caring for chronically ill members that don't always align with modern assumptions about medieval healthcare. Extended family networks, religious institutions, guild organizations, and neighborhood support systems all played roles in providing care for people facing serious illnesses like cancer. The economic burden of medieval cancer also shaped community responses to chronic illness. When productive community members became unable to work due to progressive disease, entire extended families and sometimes whole villages had to adapt. This created strong incentives for developing effective support systems and sharing economic burdens across broader social networks. Medieval legal systems also reflected the reality of chronic illness and prolonged incapacity. Inheritance laws, property transfers, and business partnerships included provisions for managing assets when key individuals became unable to fulfill their responsibilities due to illness. These legal frameworks suggest that medieval communities were well aware of the social and economic disruptions that could result from serious diseases like cancer. The religious context of medieval cancer adds another dimension to understanding how these communities coped with chronic illness and mortality. Medieval Christianity provided frameworks for understanding suffering that went beyond purely medical explanations. Illness could be seen as a test of faith, an opportunity for spiritual growth, or a pathway to salvation through patient endurance. Medieval religious institutions also provided practical support for cancer patients and their families. Monasteries operated hospitals and hospices that cared for the chronically ill. Religious communities collected donations to support families facing economic hardship due to illness. Priests and religious counselors provided emotional and spiritual support throughout the progression of terminal diseases. The medieval understanding of death and dying was fundamentally different from modern perspectives, and this difference shaped how cancer patients and their families experienced terminal illness. Death was seen as a natural and expected part of life, rather than a medical failure to be avoided at all costs. This worldview might have provided some psychological comfort to cancer patients facing diseases that couldn't be cured. Medieval approaches to pain management, while limited by available medications and medical knowledge, weren't entirely ineffective. Opium poppies were available and used for severe pain. Willow bark provided some analgesic effects. Various herbal preparations offered modest relief from symptoms. While these treatments couldn't cure cancer, they could improve quality of life during terminal illness. The social rituals surrounding death in medieval times also provided frameworks for cancer patients and families to navigate terminal illness. Last rites, deathbed confessions, and elaborate funeral ceremonies all helped communities process the loss of members to diseases like cancer. These rituals serve both spiritual and practical functions, providing closure for families while reinforcing social bonds within communities. Medieval attitudes toward disability and chronic illness were complex and varied significantly between different communities and time periods. Some medieval societies provided substantial support for chronically ill members, viewing care for the sick as a religious and social obligation. Others were less accommodating, particularly during times of economic hardship or social stress. The medieval cancer findings also illuminate the hidden costs of pre-industrial life that are often overlooked in romanticized portrayals of historical periods. While medieval people didn't face modern environmental carcinogens, they dealt with chronic diseases that could cause prolonged suffering and economic hardship for entire families and communities. The discovery of significant cancer rates in medieval populations also challenges assumptions about the relationship between medical knowledge and disease prevalence. Modern medicine has dramatically improved our ability to diagnose, treat, and sometimes cure cancer. But the medieval evidence suggests that the underlying biological processes that lead to cancer development have remained relatively constant throughout human history. This consistency in underlying cancer biology has implications for modern research directions. Understanding how cancers developed and progressed in medieval populations could provide insights into the fundamental mechanisms of malignancy that aren't obscured by modern environmental factors or medical interventions. The medieval cancer research also demonstrates the value of long-term historical perspectives in understanding contemporary health challenges. Modern cancer rates didn't emerge suddenly with industrialization, but represent an acceleration and amplification of disease processes that have been affecting human populations for centuries. This historical perspective provides context for evaluating modern cancer trends and prevention strategies. The dramatic increase in cancer rates following industrialization suggests that environmental interventions could potentially have substantial impacts on cancer incidence. But the medieval baseline also indicates that complete cancer prevention is probably unrealistic given the biological constraints of human cellular physiology. The interdisciplinary nature of the medieval cancer research points toward new approaches to understanding disease that integrate multiple types of evidence and expertise. Archaeological remains provide one type of information about medieval health. Written medical records offer another perspective. Cultural and social evidence adds additional layers of understanding. Synthesizing these different types of evidence requires collaboration between researchers from multiple disciplines who can contribute different methodological approaches and interpretive frameworks. The success of the Cambridge study demonstrates the potential for this type of interdisciplinary research to generate insights that wouldn't be possible within traditional academic boundaries. The technological innovations that enabled the medieval cancer discoveries also suggest future research directions that could further revolutionize our understanding of historical disease patterns. Advanced imaging techniques, genetic analysis, chemical testing, and other emerging technologies could reveal additional hidden aspects of medieval health and disease. The application of modern forensic techniques to historical remains could potentially answer questions about medieval cancer that current methods cannot address. DNA analysis might reveal genetic susceptibilities to cancer in historical populations. Chemical analysis of bones and teeth could detect evidence of exposure to specific carcinogens or protective compounds. The medieval cancer findings also raise questions about how historical narratives are constructed and how scientific understanding evolves over time. For generations, the absence of visible cancer evidence in medieval remains was interpreted as proof that cancer was rare in pre-industrial populations. The new findings don't necessarily invalidate previous research, but they do demonstrate how technological limitations can shape scientific conclusions. This dynamic relationship between available technology and scientific understanding has implications for how we interpret current knowledge about cancer and other diseases. Our current understanding of cancer biology, prevention, and treatment is constrained by the limits of available technology and methodology. Future technological advances will likely reveal aspects of cancer that we currently cannot detect or understand. The medieval cancer research also illustrates the importance of questioning established assumptions and applying new approaches to old questions. The researchers who conducted the Cambridge study weren't content to accept previous conclusions about medieval cancer rates. Instead, they developed innovative methodologies that could provide new types of evidence. This willingness to challenge established knowledge and develop new approaches is crucial for advancing scientific understanding. The medieval cancer discoveries demonstrate that significant gaps in knowledge can persist for generations until new technologies or methodologies make different types of investigation possible. The broader implications of medieval cancer research extend beyond academic knowledge to practical applications in modern healthcare and public policy. Understanding baseline cancer rates in pre-industrial populations provides crucial data for assessing the effectiveness of modern prevention strategies and identifying which environmental factors have the greatest impact on cancer development. The medieval evidence also provides perspective on contemporary debates about cancer causation and prevention. While modern environmental factors clearly contribute to increased cancer rates, the medieval baseline suggests that complete cancer prevention through environmental controls alone is probably unrealistic. This doesn't diminish the importance of environmental protection efforts, but it does provide more realistic expectations about what such efforts can achieve. The economic implications of medieval cancer findings also have relevance for modern healthcare policy. If baseline human cancer rates approach 10 to 14% even in optimal environments, then healthcare systems need to be designed and funded to handle that irreducible minimum cancer burden regardless of prevention efforts. The medieval cancer research ultimately challenges us to develop more nuanced and sophisticated understandings of the relationship between human health, environmental factors, and biological constraints. Cancer isn't simply a modern disease caused by contemporary lifestyle choices and environmental exposures. It's a complex biological phenomenon that has been shaping human experience for centuries. This historical perspective doesn't diminish the urgency of addressing modern cancer epidemics or reduce the importance of prevention efforts. Instead, it provides crucial context for understanding contemporary health challenges and developing realistic strategies for improving population health outcomes. The discovery that medieval people face cancer rates approaching 10 to 14% also provides a sobering reminder of the biological constraints that limit human health regardless of medical advances or environmental improvements. While modern medicine has dramatically improved cancer treatment outcomes, the underlying biological processes that lead to cancer development appear to be intrinsic features of human cellular physiology. The medieval cancer findings represent more than just a correction to historical knowledge about disease patterns. They provide fundamental insights into the nature of cancer as a biological phenomenon and its role in shaping human communities throughout history. These insights have implications that extend far beyond academic research into practical applications for modern healthcare, public policy, and our understanding of what it means to be human in the face of disease and mortality. The ongoing analysis of medieval cancer cases continues to yield new insights about historical disease patterns and their implications for modern health challenges. Each additional case study provides more data points for understanding how cancer developed, progressed, and affected individuals and communities in pre-industrial settings. The methodological innovations pioneered in the Cambridge study are now being applied to skeletal collections from other time periods and geographic regions. These expanded investigations promise to provide even more comprehensive pictures of how cancer rates have varied throughout human history and across different environmental and cultural conditions. The medieval cancer research has also sparked renewed interest in developing more sophisticated approaches to studying historical disease patterns. New techniques for analyzing ancient DNA, detecting chemical residues in historical remains, and reconstructing ancient environments are providing unprecedented insights into the health challenges faced by past populations. These technological advances are revealing that medieval health was far more complex and nuanced than traditional historical narratives suggested. Rather than simply facing acute infectious diseases and violent deaths, medieval people dealt with chronic conditions, degenerative diseases, and long-term health challenges that mirror many aspects of modern medical experience. The integration of medieval cancer findings with broader patterns of historical change also provides insights into how human health has been shaped by technological, social, and environmental transformations over time. The transition from medieval to modern cancer rates didn't happen overnight, but reflected gradual changes in living conditions, environmental exposures, and lifestyle patterns that accumulated over centuries. Understanding these long-term health transitions provides crucial context for evaluating contemporary health trends and anticipating future challenges. The medieval cancer research demonstrates that human health is shaped by complex interactions between biological constraints, environmental factors, and social conditions that operate over extended time periods. The discovery of significant medieval cancer rates also raises important questions about how we define and measure population health. Traditional approaches to historical demography focus primarily on life expectancy and major causes of death. The medieval cancer findings suggest that chronic disease burdens may have been more significant in historical populations than these traditional measures indicated. This has implications for how we assess the health impacts of historical changes and contemporary interventions. Simple measures like life expectancy or infant mortality rates may not capture the full complexity of population health patterns, particularly the burden of chronic diseases that affect quality of life without necessarily causing immediate death. The medieval cancer research ultimately demonstrates the value of applying rigorous scientific methods to historical questions and the importance of remaining open to discoveries that challenge established knowledge. The willingness to question assumptions, develop new methodologies, and integrate evidence from multiple sources has revealed hidden aspects of medieval life that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. These discoveries remind us that our understanding of the past is always provisional and subject to revision as new evidence and new techniques become available. The medieval cancer findings represent just one example of how technological advances can reveal previously hidden aspects of historical experience and force us to reconsider long-held assumptions about human health and disease. Health and disease. The medieval cancer discovery has sparked intense debate among researchers about what these findings truly mean for our understanding of disease and human biology. Some scientists argue that the 9 to 14% cancer rate represents a natural biological baseline that reflects the inherent instability of cellular processes in complex organisms. Others suggest that even medieval environments contained more carcinogenic exposures than we previously realized. This debate isn't merely academic. It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of cancer itself. Is malignancy an inevitable consequence of multicellular life, a price we pay for the complexity that makes advanced organisms possible? Or does it represent a breakdown in biological systems that can be prevented through optimal environmental and lifestyle conditions? The answer likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Cancer appears to emerge from the tension between cellular growth and cellular control, processes that are essential for life but inherently prone to malfunction. Medieval populations faced this biological reality without the additional burden of modern industrial carcinogens, yet cancer still claimed a significant portion of their communities. The specific mechanisms driving medieval cancer development remain largely mysterious. Without tissue samples or detailed medical records, researchers can only speculate about the biological pathways that led to malignancy in pre-industrial populations. However, the patterns they've discovered provide important clues about cancer's fundamental nature. The presence of metastatic disease in medieval bones indicates that cancers were following the same biological pathways then as they do today. Malignant cells were breaking away from primary tumors, traveling through the bloodstream or lymphatic system, and establishing secondary growths in distant organs. This process requires the same cellular mutations and biological mechanisms that drive modern cancer progression. Medieval blood cancers add another layer to this biological puzzle. Hematological malignancies like leukemia and multiple myeloma don't arise from external carcinogen exposure in the same way that lung or bladder cancers do. Instead, they emerge from dysfunction in the bone marrow and immune system, processes that are largely internal to the body's own biological machinery. The fact that these complex blood cancers existed in medieval populations suggests that the fundamental cellular and genetic instabilities that lead to malignancy are intrinsic features of human biology. They don't require modern chemicals or radiation to trigger their development. They can emerge spontaneously from the normal processes of cellular division and immune system function. This biological perspective has profound implications for modern cancer research and treatment. If cancer represents an inevitable consequence of cellular complexity, then our focus should shift from attempting complete prevention to developing better early detection and treatment strategies. The medieval evidence suggests that some cancer risk is unavoidable regardless of environmental controls. However, the dramatic increase from medieval to modern cancer rates also demonstrates that environmental factors play a crucial role in determining how often these biological processes go awry. The 3- to 4-fold increase in cancer incidence since medieval times represents millions of additional cases that might be preventable through environmental interventions. The challenge for modern public health lies in distinguishing between unavoidable biological cancer risk and preventable environmental cancer risk. The medieval baseline provides a crucial reference point for making this distinction. Cancer rates significantly above the medieval baseline likely reflect environmental factors that could theoretically be controlled or eliminated. The geographic distribution of the medieval cancer cases also provides insights into how environmental factors influence disease patterns even in pre-industrial times. The Cambridge study included remains from both urban and rural settings, allowing researchers to compare cancer rates between different medieval environments. Urban medieval environments presented unique health challenges that might have influenced cancer development. Cities were densely populated, poorly ventilated, and filled with craft workshops that produced various forms of pollution. Metalworking, leather tanning, textile dyeing, and other urban industries created exposures to chemicals and particulates that could have contributed to cancer risk. Rural medieval environments had their own distinct health challenges. Agricultural communities faced exposure to naturally occurring carcinogens in moldy grains, contaminated water sources, and various plant and animal toxins. They also lived in closer proximity to domestic animals, sharing diseases and parasites that could influence cancer development. The fact that cancer appeared across both urban and rural medieval settings suggests that neither environment provided complete protection from malignancy. However, the specific types and rates of cancer might have varied between these different settings in ways that could provide insights into environmental risk factors. Medieval occupational patterns also shaped cancer risk in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from skeletal evidence alone. Different trades and crafts exposed workers to different combinations of chemicals, dust, heat, and physical stress. Blacksmiths faced exposure to metal fumes and combustion products. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals used in leather processing. Millers breathed grain dust that could contain carcinogenic molds. The guild system that organized medieval crafts created occupational health patterns that concentrated specific exposures within particular families and communities. Sons typically followed their father's trades, creating multi-generational exposure patterns that could influence both genetic selection and environmental risk accumulation. Medieval women's occupational exposures were different, but not necessarily less dangerous than men's. Women worked extensively with textiles, using dyes and mordants that contained heavy metals and other toxic compounds. They managed household fires and cooking, leading to daily exposure to combustion products. They handled food preservation processes involving salt, smoke, and various chemical treatments. The domestic sphere that medieval women inhabited wasn't necessarily safer than the workshops and fields where men worked. Indoor air pollution from cooking and heating fires could be severe, particularly in poorly ventilated homes. The chemicals used in textile production, food preservation, and household crafts could be just as carcinogenic as those encountered in male-dominated trades. Medieval pregnancy and childbirth patterns also influenced women's cancer risk in complex ways. Repeated pregnancies placed enormous stress on women's bodies and immune systems. The hormonal changes associated with multiple pregnancies and extended breastfeeding periods could have influenced breast and reproductive cancer risk. However, medieval women's reproductive patterns might have provided some protection against certain hormone-sensitive cancers. Early pregnancy, multiple pregnancies, and extended breastfeeding are now known to reduce the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Medieval women typically experienced these protective factors to a greater degree than modern women. The nutritional landscape of medieval Europe created another set of complex influences on cancer development. Medieval diets were highly variable depending on season, social class, and geographic location. This variability created both nutritional deficiencies and protective factors that could influence cancer risk. Seasonal variation in medieval nutrition was extreme by modern standards. Spring often brought near-starvation conditions, as stored food supplies dwindled before new crops could be harvested. Summer provided abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables. Autumn brought grain harvests and meat from animals slaughtered before winter. Winter meant reliance on preserved foods with limited fresh nutrition. These dramatic seasonal swings in nutritional status might have influenced cancer development in ways that steady-state modern diets don't replicate. Periods of nutritional stress could weaken immune systems and cellular repair mechanisms. Periods of abundance could provide protective compounds found in fresh plant foods. The medieval reliance on preserved foods also created specific cancer risk patterns. Salted meats, smoked fish, and fermented vegetables were dietary staples during winter months. Many of these preservation methods are now known to create compounds that can contribute to cancer development, particularly stomach and digestive system cancers. However, medieval preservation techniques also created some protective compounds. Fermentation processes could produce beneficial bacteria and bioactive compounds that might have provided some protection against certain cancers. The lack of modern food additives and preservatives also eliminated exposure to some potentially harmful chemical compounds. Medieval alcohol consumption patterns present another complex factor in cancer risk assessment. Daily consumption of beer and ale provided calories and nutrients while avoiding potentially contaminated water sources. But regular alcohol consumption also increased cancer risk, particularly for liver, breast, and digestive system malignancies. The alcohol content of medieval beverages was typically much lower than modern alcoholic drinks, which might have reduced some cancer risks while maintaining the protective effects against waterborne diseases. Medieval people were essentially using low-level alcohol consumption as a public health measure, though they couldn't have understood the cancer implications of this practice. Medieval spice and herb consumption also influenced cancer risk in ways that are difficult to quantify. Many medieval seasonings contained compounds that modern research suggests might have anti-cancer properties. Garlic, onions, various herbs, and imported spices all contained bioactive compounds that could theoretically have provided some protection against malignancy. However, access to protective spices and herbs was highly variable across medieval society. Wealthy households could afford imported spices with potentially beneficial compounds. Common people relied primarily on locally available herbs and seasonings, which provided different combinations of protective and harmful compounds. The medieval understanding of diet and health was surprisingly sophisticated in some respects, while being completely wrong in others. Medieval physicians recognized that diet influenced health and prescribed specific foods for various conditions. However, their understanding of nutrition was based on humoral theory rather than modern biochemical knowledge. Medieval dietary recommendations sometimes accidentally provided cancer protection while pursuing completely different health goals. The emphasis on dietary balance and moderation might have reduced cancer risk, even though medieval physicians had no understanding of carcinogenesis. The prescription of specific foods for various ailments might have inadvertently provided protective compounds. The social context of medieval eating also influenced cancer risk through mechanisms that weren't directly nutritional. Communal eating patterns meant that food contamination could affect entire households or communities simultaneously. Food-sharing practices could spread both protective and harmful dietary exposures across social networks. Medieval food security was precarious for most people, creating stress patterns that could influence cancer development. The constant threat of famine and malnutrition created chronic stress that modern research suggests can suppress immune function and cellular repair mechanisms. This psychological stress might have contributed to cancer risk independently of nutritional factors. The discovery of medieval cancer also illuminates the hidden costs of pre-industrial life that are often overlooked in discussions of historical health patterns. While medieval people avoided many modern environmental hazards, they faced their own set of health challenges that could contribute to chronic disease development. Medieval exposure to infectious diseases was constant and severe by modern standards. Tuberculosis, leprosy, various forms of plague, dysentery, malaria, and countless other pathogens created a disease environment that kept immune systems under constant stress. This chronic immune activation might have created conditions that favored cancer development. Some infectious agents are now known to be directly carcinogenic. Human papillomavirus can cause cervical cancer. Hepatitis B and C can lead to liver cancer. Helicobacter pylori bacteria can contribute to stomach cancer. Medieval populations had extensive exposure to various pathogens that might have directly triggered cancerous changes in cells. However, the relationship between infectious disease and cancer is complex and sometimes paradoxical. Some infections might actually protect against certain cancers by stimulating immune surveillance. The constant immune activation caused by medieval disease exposure might have provided some protection against malignancy, even while contributing to other health problems. Medieval parasite burdens add another layer to this complex disease ecology. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval people were regularly infected with various intestinal worms and other parasites. Some parasites are now known to be carcinogenic, while others might have protective effects against certain diseases. The liver fluke, for example, can cause bile duct cancer in heavily infected populations. Various intestinal parasites can cause chronic inflammation that might contribute to digestive system cancers. However, some parasites might also provide protection against autoimmune diseases and allergic conditions that are common in modern populations. Medieval environmental exposures also included naturally occurring carcinogens that modern populations rarely encounter. Aflatoxins from moldy grains could cause liver cancer. Aristolochic acid from certain plants could cause kidney cancer. Various naturally occurring heavy metals and radioactive compounds could contribute to cancer risk. However, the scale and diversity of medieval environmental exposures were dramatically different from modern chemical burdens. A medieval person might encounter dozens of potentially harmful compounds throughout their lifetime. A modern person faces exposure to thousands of synthetic chemicals, many of them known or suspected carcinogens. The medieval cancer findings also provide perspective on contemporary debates about the relative importance of genetic versus environmental factors in cancer development. The consistency of cancer rates across different medieval communities suggests that genetic factors played a significant role in determining individual cancer susceptibility. Medieval populations were often more genetically homogeneous than modern populations due to limited migration and intermarriage within relatively small geographic areas. This genetic homogeneity could have concentrated both protective and harmful genetic variants within specific communities. Some medieval communities might have had genetic profiles that provided natural resistance to certain types of cancer. Others might have been particularly vulnerable to specific malignancies due to founder effects or genetic bottlenecks. The overall cancer rate of 9 to 14% might represent an average across communities with very different genetic susceptibilities. The medieval marriage and family patterns also influence genetic cancer risk through mechanisms that modern populations don't experience. Consanguineous marriage within small communities could amplify both protective and harmful genetic traits. Extended family caregiving meant that cancer susceptibility patterns would be highly visible within family networks. Medieval natural selection also operated more directly on cancer susceptibility than modern selection pressures. People with genetic profiles that made them highly susceptible to early-onset cancers were less likely to survive to reproductive age and pass those genes to future generations. This selection pressure might have maintained relatively stable cancer rates over generations. The absence of modern medical interventions in medieval times meant that cancer susceptibility genes weren't buffered by treatments that could extend survival and reproduction. This created stronger selection pressure against the most harmful cancer susceptibility variants, while allowing moderate risk variants to persist in the population. Medieval cancer patterns also provide insights into the evolutionary biology of malignancy that are difficult to study in modern populations. Cancer represents a fundamental trade-off in multicellular organisms between the benefits of cellular growth and division and the risks of uncontrolled proliferation. The cellular mechanisms that allow for tissue repair, wound healing, and adaptation to environmental stress are the same mechanisms that can lead to cancer when they malfunction. Medieval populations experienced this biological trade-off without the complicating factors of modern medical interventions and environmental exposures. Understanding how cancer evolved and persisted in medieval populations could provide insights into the fundamental biological constraints that limit cancer prevention efforts. If certain cancer susceptibility genes provided survival advantages in medieval disease environments, then complete elimination of cancer risk might not be biologically feasible. The medieval cancer research also demonstrates the importance of long-term evolutionary perspectives in understanding contemporary health challenges. Modern cancer rates represent the interaction between ancient genetic susceptibilities and novel environmental exposures. Neither factor alone explains current patterns of cancer incidence and mortality. The rapid pace of environmental change since the Industrial Revolution has created evolutionary mismatches between human biology and contemporary living conditions. Genetic variants that might have been neutral or even beneficial in medieval environments could become harmful when combined with modern chemical exposures and lifestyle patterns. This evolutionary mismatch perspective has implications for cancer prevention strategies that go beyond simple environmental controls. Understanding how genetic variants interact with specific environmental exposures could enable more targeted and effective prevention approaches that account for individual genetic susceptibilities. The medieval cancer findings also highlight the importance of considering multiple timescales when evaluating health interventions. Environmental changes that reduce cancer risk in the short term might have long-term evolutionary consequences that aren't immediately apparent. Conversely, interventions that appear harmful in the short term might provide long-term benefits through genetic selection. The discovery of significant medieval cancer rates ultimately challenges us to develop more sophisticated and nuanced understandings of cancer as both a biological phenomenon and a social challenge. Cancer isn't simply a modern disease that can be eliminated through better living conditions and medical interventions. It's an ancient biological reality that has been shaping human experience for centuries. This historical perspective doesn't diminish the importance of modern cancer research and prevention efforts. Instead, it provides crucial context for understanding what those efforts can realistically achieve and how they should be designed to work with, rather than against, fundamental biological constraints. The medieval cancer research represents a fundamental shift in how we understand the relationship between human health, environmental factors, and biological constraints. By revealing the hidden burden of cancer in pre-industrial populations, this research has forced a complete reconsideration of cancer's role in human history and its implications for contemporary health challenges. The methodological innovations that enabled these discoveries point toward new approaches to understanding disease that integrate historical, environmental, and biological perspectives. The success of applying modern medical technology to archaeological remains demonstrates the potential for interdisciplinary research to generate insights that wouldn't be possible within traditional academic boundaries. The ongoing analysis of medieval cancer cases continues to yield new discoveries that further refine our understanding of historical disease patterns. Each additional case provides more data points for understanding how cancer developed and progressed in pre-industrial environments, contributing to a more complete picture of cancer's biological and social dimensions. The implications of medieval cancer research extend far beyond academic knowledge into practical applications for modern healthcare policy, environmental regulation, and public health strategy. Understanding baseline cancer rates in relatively clean environments provides crucial data for evaluating the effectiveness of modern prevention efforts and identifying which interventions are most likely to reduce cancer incidence. The medieval cancer findings also provide a sobering reminder of the biological limits that constrain human health, regardless of technological advances or environmental improvements. While modern medicine has dramatically improved cancer treatment outcomes, the underlying biological processes that lead to cancer development appear to be intrinsic features of human cellular physiology that cannot be completely eliminated. This biological reality doesn't reduce the urgency of addressing modern cancer epidemics or diminish the importance of prevention efforts. Instead, it provides realistic expectations about what those efforts can achieve and emphasizes the continued importance of developing better treatments for the cancers that will inevitably occur regardless of prevention strategies. The discovery that medieval people faced cancer at rates approaching 10 to 14% ultimately places contemporary cancer challenges in historical context, while highlighting both the progress we've made and the challenges that remain. These findings remind us that cancer has been a constant companion throughout human history, shaping individual lives and communities in ways we're only beginning to understand. The medieval cancer research has also revealed fascinating insights into how these ancient communities understood and responded to chronic illness in ways that might surprise us. While we often think of medieval medicine as primitive and ineffective, the reality was far more nuanced. Medieval physicians weren't working in complete darkness when it came to recognizing serious diseases, even if they couldn't cure them. Medieval medical texts contain surprisingly detailed descriptions of what we would now recognize as cancerous conditions. They use terms like canker and wolf to describe aggressive, spreading sores that refuse to heal and seem to consume healthy tissue. These weren't random superstitions, but careful observations of disease patterns that medieval doctors encountered regularly enough to develop specific terminology for them. The treatments they prescribed were often brutal by our standards, but they weren't entirely without merit. Medieval surgeons would attempt to remove visible tumors, sometimes with remarkable skill given their limited tools and understanding. They used cauterization with hot irons to destroy diseased tissue, a technique that bears some resemblance to modern ablation therapies. They prescribed dietary modifications, herbal preparations, and lifestyle changes that might have provided some comfort, if not cure. But perhaps most importantly, medieval medicine recognized that some diseases were beyond human ability to cure. The concept of providing comfort care, managing pain, and supporting families through terminal illness was well established in medieval medical practice. Cancer patients may not have had access to effective treatments, but they weren't necessarily abandoned to suffer alone. The religious dimension of medieval healthcare adds another crucial layer to how cancer was understood and managed in these communities. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on caring for the sick as a spiritual duty. Monasteries operated hospitals and infirmaries that provided care for the indigent and terminally ill. These weren't hospitals in our modern sense, focused on cure and aggressive treatment, but rather places of refuge and comfort for those facing death. The medieval understanding of suffering was profoundly different from our contemporary perspective. Illness and death were seen as part of the human condition, opportunities for spiritual growth and preparation for the afterlife. This worldview might have provided some psychological comfort to cancer patients and their families, offering a framework for understanding suffering that went beyond purely medical explanations. Medieval women, who comprised a significant portion of the skeletal remains examined in the Cambridge study, faced unique health challenges that might have influenced their cancer risks in complex ways. Medieval women experienced repeated pregnancies and childbirth in an era without modern medical care, placing enormous stress on their bodies and immune systems. They also had different occupational exposures than men, working extensively with textiles and dyes that contained heavy metals and other potentially toxic compounds. Yet medieval women's reproductive patterns might have provided some protection against certain hormone-sensitive cancers. Early pregnancy Multiple pregnancies and extended breastfeeding periods are now known to reduce the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Medieval women typically experienced these protective factors to a greater degree than modern women, creating a complex interplay of risk and protection that's difficult to untangle from skeletal evidence alone. The occupational health landscape of medieval Europe presents a fascinating contrast to modern industrial hazards. Medieval workers certainly faced their own set of dangerous exposures. Metal workers and blacksmiths breathed metal fumes and combustion products daily. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals used in leather processing. Miners descended into underground spaces filled with dust and unknown gases that could damage their lungs and other organs. But the scale and variety of these exposures was fundamentally different from what modern workers face. A medieval blacksmith might work with iron, charcoal, and a handful of other materials throughout his entire career. A modern industrial worker could be exposed to hundreds of different synthetic chemicals, many of them known carcinogens, in quantities that dwarf anything a medieval craftsman would have encountered. Medieval urban environments created their own unique health challenges that might have influenced cancer development. Cities were densely populated, poorly ventilated, and filled with craft workshops that produced various forms of air and water pollution. The famous medieval guilds weren't just economic organizations, they were also occupational health hazards that clustered specific types of workers and their associated disease risks in particular neighborhoods. The waste management systems in medieval cities were primitive by modern standards, creating conditions where human and animal waste contaminated water supplies and living spaces. Tanning operations, metalworking shops, and other industries dumped their byproducts directly into rivers and streets. The cumulative effect was an urban environment that exposed residents to a complex mixture of organic and inorganic pollutants. Rural medieval environments had their own distinct health challenges. Agricultural communities faced exposure to naturally occurring toxins in mouldy grains, contaminated water sources, and various plant and animal compounds. They lived in close proximity to domestic animals, sharing diseases and parasites that could influence cancer development through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. Medieval farming practices also created specific exposure patterns that don't exist in modern agriculture. The use of human and animal waste as fertilizer created pathways for disease transmission that could contribute to cancer risk. The storage of grain in conditions that promoted mold growth exposed entire communities to mycotoxins that are now known to be carcinogenic. The seasonal rhythms of medieval agricultural life created health patterns that are almost impossible to replicate in modern studies. Medieval people experienced dramatic changes in diet, activity levels, and environmental exposures throughout the year. Winter months brought different challenges than summer seasons. Harvest time created different stress patterns than planting periods. These cyclical variations might have influenced cancer development in ways that steady-state modern lifestyles don't replicate. The human immune system and cellular repair mechanisms evolved in environments with significant seasonal variation. The relatively stable conditions of modern life, while comfortable and convenient, might not provide optimal conditions for maintaining cellular health over long periods. The genetic landscape of medieval populations adds another dimension to understanding their cancer rates that's both fascinating and complex. Medieval communities were often more genetically homogeneous than modern populations, with less migration and mixing between distant groups. This genetic homogeneity could have concentrated certain cancer susceptibility genes in specific populations while providing protection against others. Medieval marriage patterns, typically within relatively small geographic communities, could have amplified both protective and harmful genetic traits related to cancer risk. Some communities might have developed genetic profiles that provided natural resistance to certain types of cancer. Others might have been particularly vulnerable to specific malignancies due to founder effects or genetic bottlenecks that concentrated harmful variants. The absence of modern medical interventions also meant that natural selection was operating more directly on cancer susceptibility than it does today. People with genetic profiles that made them highly susceptible to early-onset cancers were less likely to survive to reproductive age and pass those genes to future generations. This selection pressure might have maintained relatively stable cancer rates over generations while filtering out the most harmful genetic variants. Medieval family structures and caregiving patterns also meant that cancer susceptibility patterns would have been highly visible within extended family networks. When multiple family members developed similar illnesses, medieval people would have noticed these patterns even without understanding the genetic mechanisms involved. This visibility might have influenced marriage choices and family planning decisions in ways that affected population-level cancer rates. The infectious disease environment of medieval Europe was dramatically different from what we experience today and might have influenced cancer development through complex biological pathways. Medieval populations faced constant exposure to tuberculosis, leprosy, various forms of plague, dysentery, malaria, and countless other pathogens. This created a disease ecology that kept immune systems under constant activation and stress. Some infectious agents are now known to be directly carcinogenic. Human papillomavirus can cause cervical cancer. Hepatitis B and C can lead to liver cancer. Helicobacter pylori bacteria can contribute to stomach cancer. Medieval populations likely had extensive exposure to various pathogens that might have directly triggered cancerous changes in cells, though we can't identify specific causative relationships from skeletal evidence alone. The relationship between infections and cancer is complex and sometimes counterintuitive. Some infections might actually protect against certain cancers by stimulating immune surveillance systems that can detect and destroy malignant cells. The constant immune activation caused by medieval disease exposure might have provided some protection against cancer, even while contributing to other health problems. Medieval parasite burdens add yet another layer to this intricate biological puzzle. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval people were regularly infected with various intestinal worms and other parasites. Some parasites are now known to be carcinogenic, particularly liver flukes that can cause bile duct cancer. But other parasites might have protective effects against autoimmune diseases and allergic conditions that are increasingly common in modern populations. The medieval diet presents another fascinating piece of the cancer puzzle, one that challenges many assumptions about nutrition and health in pre-industrial times. Medieval nutrition was far more sophisticated and varied than popular stereotypes suggest. While the foundation was indeed cereals, particularly wheat, medieval diets included a surprising diversity of foods that might have provided both cancer risks and protections. Religious observance shaped medieval eating patterns in ways that might have inadvertently influenced cancer rates. The Roman Catholic Church mandated that meat be avoided for roughly a third of the year, including the entire 40-day period of Lent and numerous other fasting days. During these periods, medieval populations consumed significantly more fish, legumes, and plant-based foods that contained compounds modern research suggests might have anti-cancer properties. The social stratification of medieval food consumption reveals some surprising paradoxes. Wealthy households often had access to more refined foods, but also consumed diets that were less nutritionally diverse than those of common people. Nobles avoided many vegetables, considering them beneath their social status, while the poor were eating what we'd now recognize as more balanced diets rich in fiber and plant compounds. Medieval beverage consumption patterns were driven by practical health considerations that might have had unintended consequences for cancer risk. Water was often avoided due to legitimate concerns about contamination, so people at every social level consumed alcoholic beverages as their primary source of hydration. These weren't the high-alcohol drinks we know today, but rather low-alcohol ales and beers that provided calories, nutrients, and safety from waterborne diseases. Regular alcohol consumption provided protection against infectious diseases, but also increased cancer risk. particularly for liver and digestive system malignancies. Medieval populations were essentially using daily alcohol consumption as a public health measure without understanding the long-term cancer implications of this practice. The absence of tobacco from medieval Europe until the 16th century represents one of the most significant differences between medieval and modern cancer risk profiles. Tobacco use is responsible for roughly 30% of all cancer deaths in developed countries today. The fact that medieval populations developed cancer at rates approaching 10 to 14% without any tobacco exposure suggests that other factors were driving malignancy development. Industrial pollution represents the other major difference between medieval and modern cancer environments. While medieval people weren't exposed to the thousands of synthetic chemicals that characterize modern life, they faced their own environmental hazards. They breathed smoke from wood and coal fires daily, often in poorly ventilated spaces. They were exposed to lead from pottery glazes and water systems. They handled toxic materials in various crafts without understanding safety precautions. The scale of chemical exposure in medieval times was orders of magnitude smaller than what modern populations face. American companies now use over 100,000 different chemicals, with more than 1,000 new ones created annually. The Environmental Protection Agency has classified over 150 of these as carcinogenic or likely carcinogenic to humans. This massive increase in chemical diversity and exposure intensity helps explain the 3- to 4-fold increase in cancer rates from medieval to modern times. The World Health Organization estimates that 20% of cancers worldwide are directly attributable to environmental risks, predominantly air pollution, chemical exposure, and occupational hazards. That represents millions of cancer cases that could theoretically be prevented through environmental interventions. The medieval cancer findings also shed new light on the relationship between cancer and aging that challenges conventional wisdom about malignancy as primarily a disease of longevity. The Cambridge researchers found evidence of cancer across different age groups in their medieval sample, not just in the oldest individuals. This suggests that cancer development isn't simply a function of accumulated cellular damage over many decades. Some cancers can develop and spread relatively quickly, even in younger adults. The blood cancer found in the middle-aged medieval man with lesions throughout his skeleton could have progressed rapidly regardless of his age. This pattern has implications for modern cancer screening and prevention programs that are typically designed around assumptions about age-related risk that may need reconsideration. The types of cancers detected in medieval bones also provide clues about the biological mechanisms driving malignancy in pre-industrial populations. Most of the evidence pointed to cancers that had metastasized to bone, particularly in the pelvis. This pattern is consistent with breast, lung, prostate, and kidney cancers, all of which commonly spread to skeletal sites when they become advanced. The presence of hematological malignancies adds complexity to the medieval cancer story. Blood cancers like leukemia and multiple myeloma don't arise from exposure to external carcinogens in the same way that lung or skin cancers do. Instead, they emerge from dysfunction in bone marrow and immune systems, processes that are largely internal to the body's biological machinery. The fact that sophisticated blood cancers existed in medieval populations demonstrates that the fundamental cellular and genetic instabilities that lead to malignancy are intrinsic features of human biology. They don't require modern chemicals or radiation to trigger their development. They can emerge spontaneously from the normal processes of blood cell production and immune system function. The medieval cancer research has profound implications for how we think about cancer prevention and treatment in the modern era. If baseline human cancer rates approach 10 to 14%, even in relatively clean environments, then a significant portion of cancer cases may be unavoidable, regardless of our prevention efforts. This doesn't mean prevention is futile, but it does suggest we need realistic expectations about what environmental and lifestyle interventions can achieve. The distinction between baseline biological cancer risk and preventable environmental cancer risk becomes crucial for resource allocation and policy development. The medieval evidence provides a reference point for distinguishing between cancers that represent intrinsic biological processes and those that result from modifiable environmental factors. The 3- to 4-fold increase in modern cancer rates compared to medieval levels represents both a public health crisis and an opportunity. If environmental factors are responsible for much of this increase, then aggressive environmental interventions could potentially return cancer rates toward their historical baseline levels. This isn't about returning to medieval living conditions, but rather identifying and eliminating the specific modern exposures that are driving increased cancer incidence. The methodological breakthrough that enabled the medieval cancer discoveries also points toward future research directions that could further revolutionize our understanding of disease throughout human history. The success of applying CT scanning and modern medical imaging to archaeological remains demonstrates the potential for technology transfer between medical practice and historical research. Similar approaches could be applied to skeletal collections from other time periods and geographic regions, potentially revealing hidden disease patterns throughout human history. What were cancer rates like in ancient Egypt, classical Greece and Rome, or pre-Columbian America? How did disease patterns vary between different cultures, climates, and environmental conditions? Each investigation could provide crucial data points for understanding how cancer rates have changed throughout human history and which factors most strongly influence malignancy development. The answers could fundamentally reshape our understanding of cancer as a human disease and provide new insights for prevention and treatment strategies. The interdisciplinary collaboration required for this research also represents a new model for addressing complex scientific questions that cross traditional academic boundaries. The medieval cancer study required expertise from archaeology, radiology, oncology, epidemiology, medieval history, and statistics. No single department or institution could have completed this work alone. This collaborative approach points toward the future of research into complex problems that require multiple types of evidence and expertise. Climate change, emerging infectious diseases, environmental health challenges, and many other contemporary issues require similar interdisciplinary approaches that can synthesize information from multiple sources and perspectives. The human dimension of medieval cancer adds poignancy to the scientific findings that shouldn't be overlooked in discussions of methodology and implications. Each skeleton showing evidence of malignancy represents a person who lived, worked, loved, and suffered through a disease they couldn't understand or effectively treat. These weren't just data points, but individual human stories of courage and endurance in the face of serious illness. The middle-aged man with blood cancer spreading throughout his bones likely experienced months or years of progressive weakness, pain, and declining health. His family watched him fade away without understanding what was happening or having any effective treatments to offer. Yet they cared for him, supported him, and mourned his loss just as families do today when cancer strikes their loved ones. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for supporting chronically ill members that reflected both practical necessities and moral commitments to caring for vulnerable people. Extended family networks, religious institutions, guild organizations, and neighborhood support systems all played roles in providing care and comfort for people facing terminal illnesses. The economic burden of chronic illness in medieval times shaped entire community responses to disease and disability. When productive members became unable to work due to progressive illnesses like cancer, families and communities had to adapt their economic strategies to support both patients and their dependents. This created strong incentives for developing effective support networks and sharing burdens across broader social groups. Medieval legal systems also reflected the reality of chronic illness and prolonged incapacity. Inheritance laws, property transfers, and business partnerships included provisions for managing assets when key individuals became unable to fulfill their responsibilities due to illness. These legal frameworks suggest that medieval communities were well aware of the social and economic disruptions that could result from serious diseases. The discovery of significant medieval cancer rates ultimately challenges us to think more deeply about what it means to be human in the face of disease and mortality. Cancer has been with us far longer than we realized, shaping human experience and communities in ways we're only beginning to understand. This knowledge doesn't diminish the tragedy of cancer or reduce the urgency of finding better treatments and prevention strategies. Instead, it places our modern cancer crisis in historical context and provides new tools for understanding one of humanity's most persistent health challenges. The medieval cancer research demonstrates that malignancy is neither a modern invention nor an entirely preventable condition, but rather a complex biological phenomenon that emerges from the fundamental processes that make complex life possible. The ongoing analysis of medieval cancer continues to yield new insights that refine our understanding of historical disease patterns and their implications for contemporary health challenges. Each additional case study provides more data for understanding how cancer developed and progressed in pre-industrial environments, contributing to a more complete picture of malignancy as both a biological process and a social challenge. The technological innovations pioneered in this research are now being applied to other historical questions, revealing previously hidden aspects of human health and disease throughout history. Advanced imaging techniques, genetic analysis, and chemical testing of ancient remains promise to uncover even more surprises about how our ancestors lived, suffered, and died. The medieval cancer findings represent more than just a correction to historical knowledge. They provide fundamental insights into the nature of cancer and its role in shaping human communities throughout history. These insights have implications that extend from academic research into practical applications for modern healthcare, environmental policy, and our understanding of what it means to be mortal beings in a world where disease and death are inevitable parts of the human experience. The story of medieval cancer is ultimately a story about human resilience, adaptability, and the endless capacity for communities to care for their most vulnerable members. It's a reminder that while medical knowledge and treatment capabilities have advanced dramatically, the fundamental human experiences of illness, suffering, and loss remain constants that connect us across centuries to our medieval ancestors who faced similar challenges with courage, dignity, and hope. Dignity and hope. The broader implications of the medieval cancer discoveries extend into fundamental questions about human biology that researchers are still grappling with today. When we examine the specific cancers found in these medieval remains, we see patterns that mirror modern malignancies in disturbing ways. The bone metastases discovered through CT scanning followed the same biological pathways that oncologists recognize in contemporary patients. Cancer cells were breaking away from primary tumors, traveling through blood vessels and lymphatic systems, and establishing secondary colonies in distant bones. This biological consistency across centuries suggests that the cellular mechanisms driving cancer haven't changed. Medieval malignancies were following the same rules of growth, invasion, and spread that characterize modern cancers. The difference lies not in the disease itself, but in our ability to detect, understand, and treat it. Medieval cancer patients experienced the same cellular rebellion that modern patients face, but they did so in complete biological darkness, without any understanding of what was happening inside their bodies. The presence of what appeared to be blood cancers in medieval remains adds another layer to this biological puzzle. Hematological malignancies like leukemia and multiple myeloma don't require external triggers in the same way that lung or bladder cancers do. They emerge from dysfunction within the bone marrow and immune systems, processes that operate according to their own internal biological logic. The medieval patient whose skeleton showed lesions throughout multiple bones was experiencing systemic cancer spread that modern hematologists would immediately recognize. This consistency in cancer biology across time periods has profound implications for our understanding of malignancy as a fundamental feature of complex life. The cellular processes that allow for tissue repair, wound healing, and adaptation to stress are the same processes that can spiral out of control and become cancerous. Medieval populations experienced this biological trade-off without any of the complicating factors that characterize modern cancer development. The environmental context of medieval cancer development presents a stark contrast to contemporary disease patterns, while revealing surprising continuities. Medieval people weren't living in some pristine, pollution-free paradise. They faced daily exposure to wood smoke from cooking and heating fires, often in poorly ventilated homes that concentrated these combustion products. They drank from lead-glazed pottery and used water systems that contained heavy metals. They worked with materials and chemicals that we now know to be carcinogenic, but in quantities and combinations that were orders of magnitude smaller than modern exposures. Medieval urban environments created their own unique cancer risk profiles that differ dramatically from rural settings. Cities concentrated craftspeople and their associated chemical exposures in dense neighborhoods where air and water pollution accumulated. Metalworking districts filled the air with particulates and fumes. Tanning quarters released toxic chemicals into local water supplies. Textile areas used dyes and mordants containing heavy metals and organic compounds that could contribute to malignancy development. Yet even these urban medieval environments pale in comparison to modern industrial exposures. A medieval blacksmith might work with iron, charcoal, and a handful of other materials throughout his entire career. A contemporary steelworker faces exposure to hundreds of different chemicals, many of them known carcinogens, in concentrations that would have been unimaginable to medieval craftsmen. The scale and diversity of modern chemical exposures represent a qualitatively different challenge than anything medieval populations encountered. The agricultural foundation of medieval society also shaped cancer risk patterns in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our modern perspective. Medieval farmers lived in intimate contact with the land, experiencing seasonal variations in diet, activity, and environmental exposure that created health patterns completely different from contemporary lifestyles. They stored grain in conditions that promoted mold growth, potentially exposing entire communities to mycotoxins that modern research has identified as carcinogenic. Medieval food preservation techniques created their own complex array of cancer risk factors and protective elements. Smoking, salting, and fermentation were essential for surviving winter months, but these processes also created chemical compounds that could contribute to malignancy development. Smoked meats contained polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that we now associate with cancer risk. Salted foods created nitrosamines that can damage cellular DNA. Yet fermented foods also produce beneficial bacteria and bioactive compounds that might have provided some protection against certain malignancies. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created health patterns that are almost impossible to study in modern populations. Medieval people experienced dramatic swings between abundance and scarcity, activity and rest, that might have influenced cellular repair mechanisms in ways we don't fully understand. Spring often brought near starvation as stored food supplies dwindled. Summer provided fresh fruits and vegetables rich in protective compounds. Autumn delivered grain harvests and meat from animals slaughtered before winter. Winter meant reliance on preserved foods with altered nutritional profiles. These cyclical variations might have influenced cancer development through mechanisms that steady-state modern lifestyles don't replicate. Human cellular repair systems evolved in environments with significant seasonal variation. The relatively stable conditions of contemporary life, while comfortable and convenient, might not provide optimal conditions for maintaining cellular health over extended periods. Medieval alcohol consumption patterns present another fascinating aspect of cancer risk that operated differently than modern drinking habits. Daily consumption of low-alcohol ales and beers wasn't recreational, but rather a public health necessity in environments where water safety was questionable. Medieval people were essentially using mild alcohol consumption as a disease prevention strategy, though they couldn't have understood the cancer implications of this practice. The alcohol content of medieval beverages was typically much lower than contemporary alcoholic drinks, which might have provided some of the cardiovascular and antimicrobial benefits of alcohol while minimizing cancer risks associated with heavy consumption. Medieval populations were navigating a complex risk-benefit calculation without understanding the biological mechanisms involved. They knew that ale was safer than water, but they couldn't have known that regular alcohol consumption also increased their risk of liver and digestive system cancers. The absence of tobacco from medieval Europe until the 16th century represents perhaps the most significant difference between historical and modern cancer environments. Tobacco use accounts for roughly 30% of cancer deaths in developed countries today. Lung cancer, which is now among the leading causes of cancer mortality worldwide, was virtually unknown in medieval populations. The fact that medieval people still develop cancer at rates approaching 10 to 14% demonstrates that tobacco was amplifying existing biological susceptibilities rather than creating cancer risk from nothing. The genetic landscape of medieval populations adds yet another dimension to understanding their cancer patterns that's both fascinating and complex. Medieval communities were typically more genetically homogeneous than modern populations, due to limited migration and intermarriage within relatively small geographic areas. This genetic consistency could have concentrated both protective and harmful variants related to cancer susceptibility within specific populations. Medieval marriage patterns often occurred within extended family networks or small communities, potentially amplifying genetic traits through mechanisms that don't operate in modern populations with greater genetic diversity. Some communities might have developed genetic profiles that provided natural resistance to certain types of cancer. Others might have been particularly vulnerable to specific malignancies due to founder effects or population bottlenecks that concentrated harmful genetic variants. The absence of modern medical interventions also meant that natural selection was operating more directly on cancer susceptibility than occurs in contemporary populations. People with genetic profiles that predisposed them to early onset cancers were less likely to survive to reproductive age and pass those genes to future generations. This selection pressure might have maintained relatively stable cancer rates over time, while gradually filtering out the most harmful genetic variants. Medieval family structures meant that cancer susceptibility patterns would have been highly visible within extended kinship networks. When multiple family members developed similar illnesses, medieval people would have noticed these patterns even without understanding the underlying genetic mechanisms. This awareness might have influenced marriage choices and reproductive decisions in ways that affected population-level cancer rates over generations. The infectious disease environment of medieval Europe created biological conditions that might have influenced cancer development through pathways we're only beginning to understand. Medieval populations faced constant exposure to tuberculosis, leprosy, various plague strains, dysentery, malaria, and countless other pathogens. This created a disease ecology that kept immune systems under continuous activation and stress. Some infectious agents are now known to directly cause cancer through mechanisms that medieval people couldn't have imagined. Human papillomavirus can trigger cervical cancer. Hepatitis viruses can lead to liver malignancies. Helicobacter pylori bacteria contribute to stomach cancer development. Medieval populations likely experienced extensive exposure to various pathogens that might have directly initiated cancerous changes in susceptible individuals. The relationship between infection and cancer operates through complex biological pathways that sometimes produce counterintuitive results. Some infections might actually protect against certain cancers by stimulating immune surveillance mechanisms that can detect and destroy malignant cells, before they become established. The constant immune activation caused by medieval pathogen exposure might have provided some cancer protection, even while contributing to other health problems. Medieval parasite burdens represent another layer of biological complexity that influenced health in ways we're still discovering. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that medieval people were regularly infected with various intestinal worms and other parasites that created chronic inflammatory conditions throughout their bodies. Some parasites are now recognized as directly carcinogenic, particularly liver flukes that can cause bile duct cancers in heavily infected populations. However, the parasite-cancer relationship isn't uniformly harmful. Some parasitic infections might actually protect against autoimmune diseases and allergic conditions that are increasingly common in modern populations with reduced pathogen exposure. The complex ecological relationships between humans, pathogens, and parasites in medieval times created biological conditions that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate. The occupational health landscape of medieval Europe presents striking contrasts to contemporary workplace hazards, while revealing some surprising continuities. Medieval craftsmen certainly faced dangerous exposures through their daily work. Blacksmiths breathed metal fumes and combustion products. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals used in leather processing. Miners descended into underground spaces filled with dust and gases that could cause respiratory damage and other health problems. Medieval women's occupational exposures were different, but not necessarily less hazardous than men's. Women worked extensively with textiles, using dyes and mordants that contained heavy metals and organic compounds. They managed household fires and cooking processes that created daily exposure to combustion products. They handled food preservation techniques involving salt, smoke, and chemical treatments that could contribute to cancer risk through mechanisms they couldn't have understood. The guild system that organized medieval crafts created occupational health patterns that concentrated specific exposures within particular families and communities. Sons typically followed their father's trades, creating multi-generational exposure patterns that might have influenced both genetic selection and environmental risk accumulation over time. These occupational dynasties experienced health challenges that were specific to their crafts, but also developed adaptive strategies for managing workplace hazards. Medieval domestic environments presented health challenges that are often overlooked in discussions of historical disease patterns. Indoor air pollution from cooking and heating fires could be severe, particularly in poorly ventilated homes where families spent long winter months. The chemicals used in household crafts, food preservation, and textile work could be just as problematic as those encountered in more obviously dangerous occupations. The social stratification of medieval occupational exposures created different cancer risk profiles across social classes in ways that might seem counterintuitive from modern perspectives. Wealthy households had access to imported goods and refined materials, but also consumed diets that were less nutritionally diverse than those of common people. Nobles avoided many vegetables and whole grains, considering them beneath their social status, while consuming more processed foods and refined sugars that might have increased certain cancer risks. Medieval medical understanding of chronic diseases like cancer was limited, but not entirely absent. Medieval physicians had inherited knowledge from Greek and Roman sources, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates, who had described various forms of malignancy centuries earlier. Medieval medical texts contain surprisingly detailed descriptions of tumours, ulcerations, and spreading diseases that we would now recognize as cancerous conditions. Medieval healers used specific terminology to describe aggressive diseases that refused to heal and seemed to consume healthy tissue. They called these conditions canker or wolf to capture their destructive and spreading nature. While they didn't understand cellular mechanisms or metastasis, they could certainly observe disease progression and its devastating effects on patients and families. The treatments medieval physicians prescribed were often harsh by contemporary standards, but they weren't entirely without merit. Medieval surgeons attempted to remove visible tumours, sometimes with considerable skill given their limited tools and anatomical knowledge. They use cauterization with heated instruments to destroy diseased tissue, a technique that bears some resemblance to modern ablation therapies. Medieval medicine also recognized the importance of comfort care and pain management for patients facing terminal illnesses. They prescribed dietary modifications, herbal preparations, and lifestyle changes that might have provided symptomatic relief, if not cure. Most importantly, medieval medical practice acknowledged that some diseases exceeded human ability to treat, emphasizing the importance of spiritual preparation and family support during terminal illness. So there you have it. The medieval cancer discovery that's rewriting everything we thought we knew about disease and human history. 9 to 14% of medieval people lived with cancer, hidden for centuries until modern technology revealed their secrets. This isn't just about correcting historical records. It's about understanding that cancer has been our companion far longer than we realized, shaping communities and families in ways we're only now beginning to grasp. The next time you hear about medieval times, remember that behind those castle walls and humble cottages were people facing the same biological challenges we do today, with courage we can barely imagine.